All right. Thanks, Rebecca. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Pete Guess. I'm the Economic Policy Director here at Arkansas Advocates for Children and Families. Thanks for joining. I know that budgeting is maybe not the sexiest topic out there, but I hope you're here because you agree that the state budget process is very important to all of us. The budget making process really is policy making. The budget is really about those priorities that our state government thinks is important, right? So those things that we care about. So in that respect, it really is the heart of the political process. And luckily here in Arkansas, it actually is fairly open and transparent. There are places as citizens, as advocates, that we can be involved and pay attention to what's going on. And so it's important to sort of understand that entire process. And as Rebecca mentioned, I'll stop periodically to answer any questions you might have. Remember to use that Q&A function. Let me, well, let's do it this way. So in lieu of maybe a standard outline of what I'm going to talk about, I have a list here of the main points to think about the budget process. These are, if you will, sort of the take-home points about the Arkansas budget process, what makes it unique, how it operates, how it works, that sort of thing. And so the process in Arkansas actually is less contentious than in other states. That has traditionally been the case. It flows pretty naturally. There's not a lot of controversy around it, even if not everyone agrees. It is unique, and I'll be talking about some of those unique characteristics as we go along. In some ways, Arkansas is very similar to other states, and there's lots of laws that govern the process. We are also really good about writing a lot of this into our Constitution. So there are lots of constitutional amendments that affect the process as well, which does put a little bit more of the power in the hands of the people. You know, the federal government, and we're hearing a lot now about the federal budget, and they're just passed another continuing resolution. The federal government does not have a separate operating budget and capital projects budget. Most states do, including Arkansas. And what that means is there's one budget for the day-to-day operations, and there's one for big capital projects. So for example, if a state agency wants to build a new building, that would be a capital project. So those are separate processes here. Further, the process is dominated by the traditional line item approach. What this means is this is probably pretty similar to the way many of you actually do your own budgeting, maybe your family budget. You might have a line item for groceries, for example, or for gasoline for your car or utilities, that sort of thing. That is very much the case for the state budget. We go line by line to fund the different aspects of operations. The Arkansas budget really emphasizes command and control. It really is a very top-down process. There's a major role for the governor. There's a major role for the legislature. But a lot of this is about accountability. States are especially concerned that citizens don't feel like their money's being wasted, that it's being, used the way it is appropriated, and that, there's bang for the buck, essentially. Many people around the country have actually applauded our budget process. We're going to talk a little bit later about the Revenue Stabilization Act, and that's kind of held up as an example of ways to get this process done. So Arkansas is very unique in that respect. And again, more to come later. And recent change to the annual budget review. And that has to do with whether we think about budgets every 2 years or every 1 year. And again, we're going to delve more deeply into that. Government spending is highly centralized. Really starts with the governor and goes down from there. That's traditionally been the case for many, many years. One might argue, in more recent years, it's become even more highly centralized with our current governor having even more control over what agencies are spending. Um, there are a variety of different revenue sources. For your own home budget, you might say, well, I have my income from my job, and that's my revenue source. But in Arkansas, we have lots and lots of different revenue sources. Uh, Arkansas has a regressive tax system. What this means is those who earn less have a higher burden on taxes. They're not necessarily paying more taxes in actual dollar amount, but a larger percentage of their income goes to taxes. That's a regressive system. The opposite, of course, would be a progressive system where you ask the high earners to pay more. One thing that's always confusing, and I've been following, state budgets for a long time. In fact, one of my first projects out of undergrad was to work on the state budget in the state of Georgia, was keeping track of what we mean by fiscal year. So, like most states, our fiscal year starts on July 1st and runs through the following June 30th. That's very typical. That's different than the federal government, by the way. The federal government starts on October 1st. But yes, we start on July 1st. And when we talk about that, when we name a fiscal year, we name it by the year that it ends. So when June comes around, June 30th, what year is that? So right now we are currently in fiscal year 2025, right? Even though we're not quite to calendar year 2025 yet. So very often a lot of people, myself included, like to really spell it out by making sure people understand when we say fiscal year 2024 to 2025. So you'll see that a little bit more in my notes here, my presentation. All right, so revenues from all sources. These are the broad classification of revenues that are available to our state government. And I will not be talking about local government. Local government has other sources, right? But we're talking primarily for state government today. General revenue. General revenue is the general taxes. Those are the taxes we levy on individuals and corporations here. So when you pay a state income tax, this goes into general revenue. That contrasts with special revenue. Special revenue is also taxes, but can also be fees and permits, that sort of thing. But what makes it special is that revenue that comes in is earmarked by law, by state law for special purposes. The most common example of this that occurs in just about every state in our country is gasoline tax. So when you go and you pump gas into your car, you're paying a state tax on top of that. And that tax goes entirely to the transportation department for specific projects like infrastructure improvement, building roads, that sort of thing. But there are other good examples too. Hunting and fishing licenses, which, hunting and fishing, very popular in our state. So those fees are used to help preserve, to restock, to make sure that we're managing the natural resources well. And other regulatory fees and fines. For example, the Department of Energy and Environmental Quality may fine someone, and those fines will be used for more enforcement activities. Then we have cash funds. Think of cash funds when somebody pays cash. It doesn't have to be physical cash, right? It can be a check or a credit card payment, that sort of thing, but you're paying for a service. Most of that money is higher ed tuition. So some of you may have gone to a public university in Arkansas or have children there. When you're paying tuition, that comes in as considered cash funds available for use by the government. Trust funds are any of those funds that are managed by the state treasurer that accrue value over time through stocks, bonds, that sort of thing. Good example of that is the teacher retirement system managed by the state treasurer. As it increases in value, we actually make money, right? So that's increased money beyond the value of those funds at the start of the fiscal year, right? And then federal funds. This is money that flows back to the states, including Arkansas, from the federal government. So we may pay, federal income tax. Some of that money comes back to the state government to use to help citizens here. So the total revenues for fiscal year 21-22 is $32.1 billion. It would be higher now. The reason I'm using these numbers, these are the latest published audited numbers for the state of Arkansas. We should be getting more recent numbers any day now because when we head into a regular legislative session, they update the next 2 years. So we'll have later numbers. And that 32.1 billion will have gone up. We will see more money for sure. But anyway, this just gives you an idea of where we are now. So here is a pie chart showing the percentages, not actually because I've hidden them, but of where the money coming in from all those sources, where it all ends up in Arkansas. Like what of those categories I just talked about, like general revenue, special revenue, trust, cash, federal money, that sort of thing. So a little bit of a quiz here. What I'm going to ask you to do is put into the chat what you think the biggest two sources of general revenue are for the state. And I think I may have to stop sharing temporarily so I can see the chat and respond.
I can tell you what people are saying.
Okay.
We got sales tax, state income tax, lottery and alcohol, federal and sales tax, fuel and gas.
Excellent. Good. Let me come back to the PowerPoint. Good. So some of you might be surprised. I know I was when I first looked at it, that I guess you could argue by far, the biggest source is federal dollars. So we actually do rely a lot on the money that comes from the federal government to support activities in Arkansas. And then you see the next biggest is the general revenue. This is general sales tax, general income tax, and sales tax actually. And special revenue, yes, we'll talk a little bit more about. And you see it down from there. Good. So receipts from all. But it is important to sort of narrow down to talk about that box called general revenue. Why is that? That's because when we talk about the state budget, we're generally not talking about that nowadays about $40 billion. We're talking about that smaller wedge of, that 27%, because that's the money that our governor and legislature have the most control over. They get to say how that money is spent. So when we think of state budget and that discretionary stuff, we're really talking about how they appropriate the general revenue, how they decide how that general revenue is going to be spent. Because, for example, trust funds, that's just accruing wealth, right? By hopefully being managed well by our state treasurer and the financial advisors, right? Federal money is pretty well earmarked. So this money might come in for, say, Medicaid, for example, right? So again, general revenue, pretty important. And here are the four real sources of general revenue, as some of you had put into the chat earlier. And so income tax, Income tax is what we pay for the money we earn. It's also corporate income tax that corporations pay for the money that corporations make, right? Um, a lot talked about these days because for over 10 years now, we've had increasing reductions in income tax rates that have mostly been on the top end of the scale. In fact, you might have heard us or other people quote over the past 10 years, we've given away about a little over $2 billion in revenue in income tax cuts, which could have been used, of course, to invest in other things in the state, other priorities. So income tax is there. Sales tax, yeah, there's a grocery tax, for example. Of course, when you go and you pay, say in Little Rock, I'm going to make this up because I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it's something like 8 or 9% in sales tax. Some of that is state money, some of that is local Little Rock money, for example. Then luxury taxes. Let's try this. Put in the chat again what you think luxury taxes are. Rebecca will help me out read those.
Someone said 15%,
Oh yeah, not
5%.
I'm sorry, I didn't phrase the question very well. What, not the percent, but what, when we say luxury tax, what are we taxing?
A new car, a boat, an additional house, boats, lots of boats and houses.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I don't think Arkansas definitely charges a sales tax. The state does on boat and uh, car sales. I don't think those are classified as luxury. When you look up how Arkansas lists it is alcohol, all forms of tobacco, cigarettes, cigars, chewing tobacco. Yeah, medical marijuana. Interesting, we call that a luxury, right? Racing and gambling, those are the big sources of luxury tax.
Aren't tampons also tax and period products taxed as luxury taxes?
I I have not heard that. I have not seen that listed in the official revenue report. Um, but they obviously are taxed. There is a sale tax on them. I can look that up.
Oh, I
Let's
may be
see.
wrong. I thought they were. It's okay. You're the
Yeah.
expert, not me.
And then one that's kind of surprising is insurance taxes and fees. So when any insurance company operating in Arkansas charges a premium to individuals or to corporations, right? That is taxed by the state. I'm sure that money, that cost is passed on to the consumer, right, in the form of our premiums. But it is, the state does make money on any premiums that are charged in the state. So, we went from that, about 30 billion for this fiscal year, this previous fiscal year, to getting down to general revenue, and the budget we can actually play around with is 8.77 billion. So quite a big reduction, right? Or a smaller amount of that overall pie. Again, because those other sources we don't really have discretion over. The state doesn't. And so those things I just talked about, sales tax, income tax, luxury tax, which one do you think was the largest source of general revenue? You can put that in the chat again.
Income tax, luxury tax, income.
Good. Yeah, definitely income tax by over 50% of that revenue. And so you might be, if you've been paying attention to tax cuts and whether you think we should have tax cuts or not, because right, nobody wants to pay taxes. But you might sit back and say, okay, well then if we're gonna keep giving away income tax, and you've heard the governor say we want to get to 0%, what does that do then to our actual state budget, the stuff we have discretion over? And how do either you have to find other revenue sources or you have to cut costs, right? And so these are things to pay attention to, especially as you advocate for the things that are important to you, right? Yeah, so what can I mention here? Obviously, sales tax, a good percent of that. By the way, sales taxes are pretty regressive, right? Because, if there's a 1 cent increase in sales tax, if you make $1 million a year, that doesn't bother you too much. If you make 20,000 a year, that 1% increase is a bigger deal, right? Maybe I could mention really quickly other I didn't talk about before. It's a very small percent. That's things like severance taxes. So when we take natural gas out of the ground, that's taxed. Estate taxes, real estate tax, real estate transitions, that sort of thing. But as you see, that's a very small percentage of this overall almost $9 billion. Right. So one more. I'm not going to give you the categories this time, but I should say, okay, remember this is 8.77. The budget for this year, 2022, was actually about 6 billion. I'll explain why that's less in a minute. But this 6 billion was distributed to major functions in state government. So take some guesses. What do you think are the largest two things that we spend this money on in general terms?
Prison and DHS, education, prison, schools, and Medicaid, education, state salaries in prison.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, here you see it again, 40%, nearly 40% public schools, right? And this is typical of state governments, right? Generally speaking, education is not a federal function, it's a state function. That's pretty well spelled out in the Constitution. It's a states' rights issue. And so, a big percentage, right? And then some of you guessed Health and Human Services. True, look at that's a big percent, right? Almost a third. And then it goes down from there. And if you want to think more broadly about education in general, you have to add up public schools, which is the orange, higher education, the green, the Department of Education, which is, running schools. That's like the actual department, the people that work there. Right. So if you added those together, sorry, I did not do the math on that ahead of time. 35 and 40, we're getting about to almost to 3/4 of the budget. And so again, I know I can hear those wheels turning, right? You say, okay, we have income tax coming in. We're going to get, well, the governor is saying we want to get to 0. A lot of that income tax goes to fund this pie here, right? How do we keep paying for things like education? Or some of you mentioned prisons, right? Corrections is big there. It's 8% of our budget, right? And so the question becomes, again, as we think about tax cuts, how do we fund those things that are important to us, right? Good. So I mentioned before, we started with almost 9 billion, spent almost 6. What happened to the last 3 billion, right? Well, by law, by constitution, there are some things that are taken off right at the top. So we have gross, we're left with net because, $500 million goes back to people in tax refunds. There are some trust funds that were put in place, a lot of them around education excellence and adequacy because of, you might have heard about Lakeview and some of those processes. So those are put in place. So that stuff's taken off right at the top. And then we do some budgeting. Oh, I should mention constitutional officers. So paying for them and their staff is another $300 million, right? And then there are budgeted uses, again, by law that we do automatically. So transportation department gets 50 million right off the top, and restricted reserve fund, like rainy day fund, gets some money there too. And that budget year, we had about a $1.6 billion surplus. We heard a lot about these surpluses, right? And a surplus is a philosophical kind of statement. It's saying this is money we have left over that we don't need to spend. So one person could say, well, let's invest that in things that are important to us, right? Instead of calling it a surplus and sort of banking that dollars or giving it away in tax cuts. Um, Another thing that is a little bit important to remember about these surpluses, because again, we're talking 2022, right, is we had extra federal money flowing in at that time. Now, this surplus would not be federal dollars, but if we have federal dollars going to other things, we don't necessarily have to spend state dollars on those things. So we got to be careful when we think about what a surplus really is. This seems like a good place to stop and see what questions you might have.
We did, I don't know if it was exactly a question or statement or both.
Yeah.
But we had one, that it's basically questioning the luxury tax, and are some of those items that you mentioned really luxuries to
Mhm.
people who are low income?
Yeah. 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 You're right. That's both a statement and a question, right? Yeah. Uh, Traditionally, folks have thought of luxury taxes as almost a tax on, there's almost a morality question. And I'm not saying that's still the motivation, but like, you know, alcohol, good thing, bad thing, let's tax it, right? And taxes can be a way to change behavior, right? If you want to stop people from smoking cigarettes, you put a big luxury tax on it, right? Because you say it's a good people can do without. Those do hurt folks at lower income for sure. So they can be regressive. And yeah, I think there is a question about what is the purpose of those taxes. So those are good points.
Don't see any other questions so far, but if people do have questions, we're gonna stop again in a bit. You can put them in the Q&A.
Yes, absolutely. Keep them coming. Thank you. Yeah, so let's talk about the actual budget cycle now, how the budget gets made. Right. These are the four major steps: budget preparation, submission, the legislative review and approval. I'm not going to spend a lot of time at all on the budget implementation and the audit and evaluation. Just know that happens on the sort of back end. Some of you are advocates and you're interested in going out there and fighting for, funding for those things you believe in. First two steps are really important, right? It is important as citizens to monitor the rest as well. It's just a little bit beyond the scope of what we have time for here today. Yeah. Some of you, you're probably familiar with this, right? We have two types of legislative sessions. We have a regular session that happens in the odd numbered years. So we are getting ready now for a regular legislative session that will start in January of 2025. And in regular sessions, the legislature does consider fiscal legislation. They do think about the budget. In fact, it's a very important time to think about the budget. But they also think about what we call substantive legislation. So if they want to put a law in place that affects human behavior in some way, right, they can do that there during the regular session, but only during the regular session. A few years back, when Roe v. Wade was overturned and folks started thinking in Arkansas legislators that we need to do something here. There were some legislators who said during a fiscal session, we want to do some new laws about abortion. And I was very happy to see the leadership in both chambers said, no, that's not appropriate for a fiscal session. Can only do that in a regular session. And that by constitution, that is what we, the people, told the legislature they could do. So it was good that they followed the Constitution there. But during the regular session, when they're looking at fiscal legislation, they consider all agencies, all boards, all the commissions, all institutions, right? So all the budget for the entire state government. And as we are going into this session in 2025, they will be considering 2 years of budget. So fiscal years 25 to 26 and 26 to 27, right? That happens. However, they will approve those budgets, but they will only appropriate money for the next year that will start. They're meeting in winter, right? Winter to early spring. They will be considering and appropriating money only for the fiscal year that will start that July 1st, a few months after they're done, right? And I'll explain difference between budget and appropriation in a minute. Yeah, in contrast to that is the fiscal session, which happens in even number years. That's a relatively new thing. In fact, it was a constitutional amendment approved by voters in 2008, Amendment 86, that before that time, the legislature only met in odd years. So they only met every other year. So it's relatively recently that we've added this fiscal session. But during the fiscal session, they can only look at fiscal legislation, as I just said, and they only look at the big 6 agencies, and I'll list those in a minute. But those big 6 agencies, because you remember looking at that pie chart before, they total 90% of the budget. So they're really only reviewing those 6 agencies. But again, that's a large part of the budget. And then they appropriate bills for that even year. So when they meet in 2026, it'll be a fiscal session and it'll be looking at that fiscal year. And this is what the busy Gantt chart looks like. I think the take-home message here is the work never stops, right? As soon as a legislature approves a budget, then the departments are back out there, the executive departments, creating the new budgets. So that stuff is happening, has already happened. The governor has made it clear her priorities to the agency heads. They've prepared budgets. They've sent them back to the governor. The governor and her staff, usually her staff, right, sits down with agency heads and goes over the budgets and makes corrections, suggestions, changes, right? And so that's happening right now. And we're getting to the point now where the legislature becomes involved. This is the important part for us as advocates. So you see here on maybe like the third line in white, the ALC, the JBC. So that's the Arkansas Legislative Council. That's the small group of legislators from both chambers who sort of keeps the work going of the legislature when it's not in session, right? And then there's a joint budget committee that has senators and representatives as well. And so they come together to review the budget. When you add up the ALC and the JBC, it comes to 135 reps and legislators, reps and senators. That's about 60% of the overall membership. So a big majority of those elected are sitting down to review this process, the budgets. And this will happen starting in October and last about 3 months. And then obviously in January, the legislative stuff happens, and then we start getting all the action on the bills at that point. I will say, certainly the budget can be changed when the session happens because it's up to the legislature to approve the budgets. But a lot of the work happens in these in these budget hearings that will be starting in 2 weeks, actually. I think October 8th is the first day of hearings. Yeah, and then you see an abridged version for the fiscal session. We won't linger and talk about that, but there it is. Yeah, so roles for everybody, right? As I mentioned already, the governor sets the budget priorities. She has communicated to agency heads what she expects, where she expects them these days to cut costs, that sort of thing. Things like, personnel requests have to come through her. We're not going to add more people, generally speaking, right? And then she has the Department of Finance Administration put together manuals, instruction manuals and forms for the agency heads to fill out. So they're putting together their budget requests. Also, within DFNA, official revenue forecasts come out. So they have experts there, economists who say, we're looking at taxes, we're looking at all kinds of economic activity. What kind of revenue can we expect? That happens several times throughout the year, but it's really important right now as we're heading in to see what kind of revenue we'll have during this period. It's an art, right? There's some science behind it, but there's also an art to predicting that. The revisions that happen right now for the current fiscal year that we're not very far into. The DFNA forecasters are saying we're going to have about a $300 million surplus at the end of the year. To give you some idea of how much that is, I mean, to us, 300 million sounds like a lot of money, right? That comes out to be about 3% of the budget. And so it's actually a pretty tight budget year that we're operating in currently. Yes, she and her staff have those hearings these aren't the legislative hearings. These are the things she does within her office with the agency heads. And then she recommends the budget to that joint committee, and might also recommend additional sources of revenue. Like she might recommend that we up the state sales tax, for example. So that's possible. Related, the state agencies are creating those budget requests, and because we're heading into a regular session, they're doing it for 2 years, right? Those are the fiscal years they'll be preparing right now, and they have experts within the Office of Budget to help them with that. These are the kinds of things that happen in a budget request. Let me actually stop sharing this and show you what that request really looks like. Let's see here. This is here. Yeah, this is typical. The format is pretty much the same. Interestingly, some departments like to make it look prettier with pictures and graphics and stuff, but this is what the basic information looks like. I don't know about you guys, but even though I've been in Arkansas for 17 years now, and I know how important catfish is, I didn't know we had a catfish promotion board, right? So that's pretty fascinating to me. This is fairly simple because they don't get a lot of money, right? So it says, for example, because by state law, they have to say contracts to minority-owned businesses. There's none, right? If they had employees, it would be listed here, but they do not have employees. And then what annual publications they have to produce. Some general explanation. And it says basically the board is requesting to continue appropriation in the amount of 120,000. And then you get into the actual budget request. We have what they spent actually during 1 year, what was budgeted the next year, what was authorized at the end of the day. So that's passed by the legislature, and then what they're requesting for 2 years. This, by the way, is for the last regular session because the new request manuals aren't out yet. They should be very soon because we're going into budget hearings, but they're not published yet. So I'm showing you 2 years ago. That's a lot. They can be a lot more complicated, right? Even the State Claims Commission is a little more complicated. Here's the number of employees. This stuff is required again by law, the stuff at the top, the reports they produce, how the money is that they're requesting. By the way, there's columns for agency request and then what the executive, that means the governor, is requesting. lately these days with our new, relatively new governor, I guess she's been there 2 years now, right? Those almost always line up because she's doing all the work on the front end. And you almost never see an executive request that is more than the agency request, right? She'll, or her staff will be revising it down in places, but it usually doesn't change very much between the agency request and the staff request. The executive request. Yeah, okay. So any questions at this point? I think there might be one.
Yeah, we had a question about something you talked about earlier. Can you explain why the higher ed budget is separate from the public education budget?
Um, yes, that's just history. So those were very distinct departments doing stuff very differently. The missions are very different, right? You may remember several attempts to simplify the organizational structure of government. I think Hutchinson was the most recent to do it, and we went from something like 40-something departments down to 15. So there's much more melding now between higher ed and public education. And in fact, you might argue as an educator that there haven't been good linkages because of that separation between, okay, we're done with them in 12 years after 12th grade. We don't care what happens next, or higher ed not thinking about what happens to prepare them for higher ed. So lately, I'm very pleased to see as an educator myself, this real push to get public education and higher ed to talk together and work together and plan together. I do not see any melding of the budgets though, because it's both of them are really, really complicated, really large portions of what we do, and very distinct sort of budgeting request processes. As you might imagine, with all the different units in higher education, each one has its own budget. That's all coming together in a centralized place. And so it'd be really complicated to add that to sort of the budgeting process the Department of Education goes through. Yeah, so that's in a nutshell, but I think it's pretty historical that why it started that way. Anything else there?
Nope, that's it right now.
Okay, back to this PowerPoint. All right, yes, so that's what's required there in the budget manuals, which are public information, by the way. You can go to the website, and I have links at the end of this where you can go and look at them yourself. And like I said, we're anxiously awaiting the new ones so that we can see where we are for the next 2 years. Fiscal session, I said already, it's an abbreviated process because it's only fiscal. They're not doing any other laws. They're just passing budget stuff. And here are the big 6 agencies, which are not surprising to you. These are the things that you guessed when I said, where's general revenue being spent? These are all the things that make up 90% of the budget. Yeah, so then the governor obviously hands this stuff off to the legislature. And this joint budget committee, along with the ALC, reviews the request, considers the governor's recommendations, and goes through that process October through December, and then recommends that budget to the General Assembly. It's like I said, I mentioned before, the budget is not changed very much from the budget hearings to the point it gets to the legislature. There are a few things, a few changes at the margins for sure, but not a whole lot happens there. The legislature also recommends state employee salary levels, and then prepares the appropriation bills. So appropriation is different than the budget. And again, I'll get to that. Yes, this just continues. That the only thing worth mentioning here is that the governor does have a cover letter that comes out on top of the budget request, and it really does highlight her priorities. So the last one, and usually she publishes it right on her website as well. So her priorities was, last year was flat spending, Earns Act increases in spending, that sort of thing. So there were not a lot of changes in the the last but governor's letter and her budget. And again, this was only for a fiscal session. This will be her first real regular session. So we're curious to see what kind of changes there might be. Now, and they also, during these joint hearings, members can make suggestions and changes, but it really is during the session when members may see things like, we saw this at the last fiscal session, defunding public broadcasting, for example, PBS. So those things are considered. They go first through the JBC, like any other committee, before it comes to the whole floor of the House or the Senate. Yep. Recommend appropriation bills to the General Assembly, pay levels, and the RSA is really important, and we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, I've said many times now, an appropriation is different than a budget. So yes, the legislature approves the budget. They say, yes, we vote in favor of this budget, right? But approving that is not enough to actually get money to departments or commissions to spend, right? You first need an appropriation. And an appropriation says, okay, we're going to take this budget item and we're going to say, yes, you can then, we give you authority to spend that money. However, it's not actually the money either. It doesn't send along the money. What it then says to the state treasurer is to release that money, usually on a monthly basis throughout the fiscal year. By constitutional law, all types of revenue must be appropriated in Arkansas. So even federal money is listed in an appropriation. I put this except thing in there because there is a weird exception, only one that I know about, and that is there is settlement money that goes directly to the attorney general, like tobacco settlement money that he is authorized to spend without an appropriation. There's lots of accountability, lots of reporting back to the legislature, but it does not go through the legislative process. That's the exception I know of. No appropriation agency can't spend money. And spending is limited by the available appropriation or the available money, whichever is less, right? So if we do not get as much revenue in to fund the entire budget, then they may not, an agency may not be able to spend the entire appropriation because there simply isn't money. So in that respect, it's sort of a complicated process. Yes, I already said that first item. Things that, these are things in the Constitution, right, that govern this process. We don't do ranges in the state. We don't say you're authorized to spend between $1,000 and $3,000, for example. It's exact amounts down to the dollar. A 1-year limit on appropriations. So that was part of that Amendment 86 in 2008 that said we're only going to appropriate every year. And so there's not, you don't do 2 years at a time. Appropriation bills do require 3/4 vote of the General Assembly to pass of the legislature. This is sort of unique in Arkansas, and it was sort of designed to make sure there is agreement around budget issues. And so you might have heard the Democratic Party of Arkansas talking about, can we just get to baby steps, you know, enough Democrats in one or the other chamber to be able to have that leverage on spending bills. And here's what's super unique about Arkansas. By Constitution, the Constitution says we, every activity, that's how it's said, every activity of state government must be a separate appropriation. As you might imagine, there are lots of activities for state government. So we have hundreds and hundreds of appropriation acts. It's a lot of work for the legislature to go through. This is highly unusual, as I mentioned. The norm across the country is one appropriation bill. So most states out there say, okay, we're going to appropriate it all at once, but we do each one. You might say, well, that is, maybe tighter control over each of these acts, but at some point it just becomes sort of a rote process. You're just kind of stamping these things because there's a lot of them, right? I mean, of course, we like to think legislators are paying attention, right? Any questions so far?
I don't see, wait, yes, there are a couple.
Okay.
So 3/4 of the General Assembly have to pass the budget?
Has to pass appropriation bills. So the budget is separate, it takes a simple majority to pass the budget, but then to actually say you're authorized to spend money takes 3/4.
So the budget's a plan.
Yes.
And then you have to decide whether you put money into the plan.
Yeah, I mean, and the plan does list amounts, right? But then it takes the legislature saying, okay, we have this overall budget. Now let's take the next step and say, okay, yes, you're now authorized, Department of Education, you're now authorized to spend this. Yes. So, and that's what takes 3/4.
And the next question is, can you explain the different buckets that appropriations are put into?
I think I will get to that. If not, re-ask that question, but I think I'll cover that.
Got it.
Yep. Okay, there are various types of appropriation bills. The most common is the first one I have listed here, and that's the regular agency operating appropriation. That's saying, okay, these are the things that it takes you to operate for a fiscal year. Right. And so it's, personnel and supplies and travel and continuing education and that sort of thing. Right. So that's mostly what you see, and that's what we need to keep government running. Right. A supplemental appropriation usually happens when in the middle of a year, like a budget's already been passed, an appropriation's already been passed. Somewhere in the middle of the year, the federal government says, we're going to send you money to do this new thing, right? It takes a new supplemental appropriation to authorize the ability to spend that money. Doesn't happen very often, but it does, and it's a process is necessary, so you don't have to wait until the next time the legislature meets to get that money flowing, right? Yes, okay. Construction, so this is on the capital side. And so there has to be an appropriation again to spend any sort of money. And so you're appropriated money to build this thing, right, that you want to do. And then there's a reappropriation. It's usually related to construction cost. Because some of you may have been involved in some of these, new building projects. It almost never happens that you can get a building built within the confines of a fiscal year, right? And so you need to continue that authority into the next fiscal year. So it's not new money. It's just saying, yes, you can continue to spend that money. We appropriated you because you were unable to spend it during the course of this fiscal year. Right. And I won't click on these links to show you the different examples, but Arkansas Soybean Appropriation Board gets a regular appropriation just to run the day-to-day activities. Right. Department of Human Services got new money in from the federal government and needed a supplemental to spend more money. Institution of higher ed are the ones that often have projects that, building a new dormitory on a campus, right? That might be a multi-year project, so you need that to continue going. Or the initial capital project spending for Department of Safety, building a new training facility, for example. Yeah. And so again, by law, there are certain things that have to appear in an appropriation. Regular salaries, extra help is usually temp employees or part-time employees. Then, maintenance and general operations is kind of a catch-all for various categories. And then there might be certain special line items like, state police might need to buy a bunch of vehicles, for example. And so that might be there as a special line item. And there's a very technical format, again, by law. Where is appropriation being made? What is the purpose of the appropriation? How much spending and where is the money used to fund this authority? So here's a good example. This is the parole board appropriate. So it says it's going to the parole board. It's coming from the miscellaneous agencies fund account. So on the management side, the state treasurer has these various funds that have been built over time. That's where things like general revenue and federal money and special revenue are put. And that's the money that, then you take out of to fund these things. So miscellaneous agencies fund account. And it's for personal services and operating expenses. So this is a general operating appropriation. Lists those things, and then it says at the end of the day how much is appropriated, right? And so this is what, $2.2 million. So when you see appropriation acts, they look exactly like this. There could be more information explaining it, right? But it again, there are hundreds of these, and so following the same format really helps the legislative staff put these things together. Any questions there, Rebecca?
I don't see any right now.
Okay, very good. All right. So again, these are the things that are defined by law, and Constitution, actually. The general appropriation bill must be passed first. That general appropriation bill is money off the top to run basically constitutional offices. I have no idea why that's important, but that is passed first. So the legislature always starts with that. I already mentioned 3/4 of the legislature is needed to pass appropriation bills. They can be introduced in either chamber, so they usually try to split the love there and spread them out. But they do have to be voted, like any other law, have to be approved by both chambers, right? And then they eventually go to the governor, like any other law that's passed, and she has the authority to sign or veto them. It's super unusual to see a veto because, at least in recent years, the legislature has not, changed very much from the governor's recommendation. So, but one thing that is very unusual, well, I mean, it's not unusual for states, but the president of the United States does not have the line item veto. The governor does. What that means is the governor, it used to be, because everything was on paper, she would literally take out a red pen and a ruler and cross out one line or however many lines she didn't agree with. And that was removing those lines from the law. So if there was an expenditure that she didn't like for, I don't know, travel, she could cross that out, right? So theoretically that can happen. Again, it's very rare. It cannot add things, can only cross out things. But like I said, pretty unusual. Yeah. So, yeah, when you think about where these funds come from, these are the three general sources. I won't go into a lot of details here, but dedicated sources, so special revenue. So if I'm going to fund road building, it's going to come from the gasoline tax. If I'm going to fund operations at, the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, it's going to some of that is going to come from cash funds from tuition payments, right? Capital funding projects usually come from interest earnings over time that build up. So it's usually not directly from the taxes we pay. Well, it could be indirectly, right? Because fund balances, so if a state agency is not spending all of its money, that money is collected and can be used for capital projects, right? And then finally, general revenue comes through something called the Revenue Stabilization Act. Very unique. This is the thing that I again say a lot of other states are kind of envious of. So what did it do? Why is it important in Arkansas? For one thing it did, there's been a history of saying, let's take major taxes and say, the sales tax can only go for education. And that made it pretty limited to use discretion by the governor and the legislature to be able to, use money how they want to, right? So remove that earmarking process. But probably more importantly, it reduced funding instability. So let's say, at the, more like right now, the DFNA is projecting, what kind of money we'll have coming in over the next 2 years, right? Because the legislature is going to consider budgets for the next 2 years. There's some art to that, right? And they may be wrong. There may be lots of changes. Like we might go into a recession, people start spending a lot less money. We don't get sales tax, right? As much sales tax. What most states have to do, if that happens in midstream, is start telling agencies that they have to cut spending drastically. So this is a way of allocating general revenue that protects against that, prevents deficit spending, prevents, these draconian across the board cuts that might have to happen. So how does it work then? Legislature and governor determine the maximum general revenue support. That's the overall budget. How much money are we going to get? So how much are we going to expend? How is that distributed to different funds? Then says, okay, across the entire state government, we're going to have funding priorities. And we're going to determine how much funding goes into each category, each priority. And I have a schematic in a minute that'll help explain this. And then the governor and state agencies determine what are the priorities within each agency within those funds. And then it actually is a law. The Revenue Stabilization Act is a law. So they're not passing a new law every year, but every year they are amending the Revenue Stabilization Act. So they change it every year based on these new buckets and the new funding. So how does this work? So the government says, okay, we have this big pot of money, right? We're going to put most of it in pot A because that's where our real priorities are. And then if the revenue's coming in as expected, then we're going to have enough left over to do the priorities in B. And then if we're going to have enough after that, we'll go ahead and do C. There's nothing that says there has to be 3 buckets. Very unusual. This past fiscal session, they only had 1 bucket A because they were so confident in having a surplus of revenue. They didn't worry about other buckets. But typically there are 2 or 3. I have seen more. I've seen 4 buckets, depending on how lean or how tight the budget is, right? So then what happens is, again, the governor and the agencies say, okay, legislature's got this overall amount. They put money into A, B, and C, right? Well, A has got to be those big things that we've got to do, right? We got to fund our public schools. We've got to fund higher ed. We've got to keep our prisons running, right? A lot of it is education and safety and health-oriented kind of stuff, right? Well, then if we have money left over, let's do extra programs in human services, right? You see here an example, county jail reimbursement. That comes up a lot because we don't have, well, I'm not making a political statement right now. We don't have beds to house all the people who are in prison now. So the county jails are holding a lot of those people on behalf of the state. And a lot of those county jails have gone without reimbursement. And so if we have money left over, let's reimburse the counties for holding those prisoners since we don't have state facilities to hold them, right? And then, whatever lower priorities you might put in C as an example. Yeah, I want to show you, and before I ask for questions, what that actually looks like. Let me see where I put yes, if you were to follow the link here on this that I just showed you a minute ago, you would end up here in our legislature's website. By the way, there's great stuff here for searching, proposed legislation or legislation that became law over time. So Act 888 was the Revenue Stabilization Amendment that happened last year. And so if I click on that, it comes up. Wait, this is regular session 2023, so this wasn't last year. I didn't use last year's because last year's only had one bucket, and that would defeat the purpose. Things that are crossed off are things that were no longer necessary, so they amended it by deleting it, right? But what you come down to, I know there's a lot of legalese and stuff that's hard to read, but down here in section 6, allocation A, so that's that first budget, right? It says, okay, we're going to put a little over $6 billion into that first bucket, right? And then it lists all the funds where that money is going. Right off the top, public school fund, right? A big portion, as we've already discussed. And you come on down, it lists all the way across all the funds in Arkansas. Then it gets to allocation B. Look at this. This is 192 million. So you had 6 billion and then you have 192 million. So bucket B is a lot smaller. So they were saying this, we have a good surplus. We're not real worried about this. We think we're going to get to B, but let's put it off to the side just in case. And then I don't think there was a C. Nope, no C 2 years ago. Yeah, so that's what it looks like. It looks kind of complicated, but the most important thing is to see what happens in B and in A and B and what the difference is there. What's super interesting is, as an advocate, you could be like, oh, great, this new project is, it's been approved in the budget and, it's been, there's been an appropriation, but it could be down the road if B never gets funded, that new project never takes off because the agency says that's not a priority. We've put that into the B bucket. And now the state treasurer is saying that we don't have money to fund B, right? So things could happen that way. I do worry a little bit that it could be political. You could say, let's have a C and let's put stuff there that we know we won't fund. And then we can say, hey, yeah, we have a nod to this activity, politically, but, it's not going to happen. I haven't really looked in detail to see if that's actually ever the case, but it could happen. Any questions, Rebecca?
I don't see any right now. One question I have, where people can type them in the chat or in the Q&A. Are there ways that people can engage in the budget hearings that are coming up?
Yes. I'm going to get to that in just a second.
Perfect.
Yes, I know. I kind of want to end with that because I want to emphasize it. As I mentioned before, I'm not going to spend much time on the budget implementation and oversight phase. It is important. It's important for accountability for sure. I've listed information here in the PowerPoint, but we won't talk about it directly. Yeah, and so as a way of closing before the closing, what are the current issues and challenges? Some folks are not super happy with this 2008 amendment that started a fiscal session. There have been at least 2 proposed constitutional amendments that never got very far to end the fiscal session. There are pros and cons, right? Some of the pros is it puts maybe more accountability, more check-ins. The legislature's paying attention year to year and not every 2 years. Also helps because of the economic uncertainty from year to year. So that's one of the pros. The cons are, it is clear Arkansans really like a non-professional legislature. That sounds kind of funny to say. I'm not talking about they're all amateurs, right? But, a place like California, big state, legislature meets regularly. That's kind of your full-time job, right, as a legislator. Arkansas, we like it being, farmers and teachers and business owners and whoever can afford time away to be active. And the more you move towards meeting more often, you're moving more towards a professional legislature, which Arkansans don't like. It takes folks out of their districts and puts them in the capital more often. So the question is, well, how long will we keep this? I don't think there's any real movement to ending the fiscal sessions, but it could happen. I mentioned the multiple tax cuts several times. If we went from a $1.5 billion, quote unquote surplus, and now we only have a $300 million surplus, it seems hard to think about further tax cuts without thinking about replacing that revenue in some way. How do you do that with sales tax? How do you do that? I don't know. Some folks in the legislators are openly now saying if we're going to get to zero income tax, it means cutting programs, and that's a real problem, right? If you're a fan of government, well, I should say, if you're happy with the level of spending or you want increased spending, that's a problem. Term limits isn't the biggest problem as it was, but for a while, Arkansas had the I guess worst, depending on your respective term limits, the shortest term limits, right? And so there were times when people would come in and there was so much turnover that nobody really knew how to write a budget or approve a budget. So that was a problem. It's better now. And how much money do we set aside in rainy day fund? Lately, it's been enough because of federal help, but that's always something to consider for sure. Okay, to get to Rebecca's question and stuff that I know you're all interested in, there are really three important touch points to advocacy, places that you can have your voice heard. We're getting ready in October. As I mentioned, October 8th is the first joint budget hearings. What happens in this process? Typically, there's not public testimony. What happens is agency heads come before the committee and present their budget requests, and the legislators ask lots of questions, right? But it's worth paying attention, especially in those departments or agencies you're especially interested in, to see where the big changes are, to see where you don't think there's enough funding. Because then what you do is reach out personally to your legislator or anybody on the Joint Budget Committee, and through email or phone calls or letter writing. I think phone calls and letter writing are much more powerful than emails, but you can reach out and advocate for increased spending for something you really believe in. By the way, you don't have to go in person to watch these budget hearings. You can watch them online. And I'll show you in just a minute how you can find out more information about those. The governor releases her final budget in November. And that's when you get that cover letter, because you probably don't want to look through, the hundreds of pages of the budget, but the cover letter really brings stuff home, like where are the priorities. That's a time to, again, contact your elected officials, including the governor's office, but also do maybe more public advocacy. So letters to the editor, speaking at other, holding like sessions where you get people together to talk about it through either your membership organizations or things like that. Just ways you can bring people together and educate them on the budget and have them do some advocacy as well. And then finally, the legislative session, that's when they actually vote on the stuff. And there is time again to show up at the Capitol and advocate and be in communication with your legislative officials at that time. Let me show you when we're talking about where to find out more stuff about these budget hearings that are coming up. Let's see how I think it is. Yes, okay. Yeah, I personally feel like the state legislature has done a great job with the website. Sometimes it takes a few clicks to find what you're looking for, but a lot of public information is here and available, which is super nice. This is just the homepage, right, which is arcleg.state.arkansas.us. Of course, you can just type Arkansas legislature into a search engine and it'll get you right here. Right here, you can, at the top, you can search for bills that you're interested in following. This is really important during the legislative session, and there are more advanced search engines as well. There's a whole section on budget where they will be posting the budget once it starts coming out, those budget requests. But it tells you what committees are happening and where they're happening, and they're open to the public, right? So you can come. again, watch it. Typically, you can watch it remotely as well. I have to click on this month to get further out. And you could put dates at the top for what you're looking for. But when you pan down, scroll down here, Tuesday, October 8th, the joint budget hearings start. Room A in the MAC, they call it the Big Mac. That's that administrative building just, what is that? I guess that's west of the Capitol.
Look for
It,
all the construction and it's
yeah, that's
behind
right.
it.
That's right. They're building a tunnel between the Capitol and that building, and so there's lots of construction. Yeah, good point. Right now you see only an agenda. As they get closer, they'll be uploading docs, the documents that the same ones the legislators have, so you can look through those. They don't quite have them posted yet, but when you click on the agenda, you see the what did I say? The 160 some odd, I mean, no, 67 people, something like that, that are involved here. Uh, right. 60% of the legislature. And here's what they're going through, right? So this is their first one, so they've got to adopt the rules and figure out where everybody's seating and that sort of thing. But then the meat of the stuff is they're starting to get into the budget requests. So they're starting off with labor and health. But it looks like these are the boards and commissions that they're starting with, right? And so if we went further out, let's just go to the next one, Wednesday, the very next day. Oh, I didn't mean to click on that. That just takes you to more information. Wednesday agenda. Yeah, still working through commissions, right? That's kind of the easier work. So that's where they're starting. They're giving the big agencies more time to complete their budgets. Yeah, so pay attention to those that are important to you. And after they meet, by the way, you can usually click on a link to get to the recording so you don't have to watch it live. Yeah, some of that's pretty boring, but some of it you can fast forward through and get to the, the agency head that you're interested in. But I will say, because budget making is policy making. It's great if we can have more citizens, more advocates paying attention to what really happens in these budget hearings. That is a really good time to reach out to, again, your elected official. Also a good idea to reach out to the chairs of that joint budget committee as well. More people they hear from, the better. One of the tricks is when you're writing them, if you're representing a group of people, say so. Like I'm representing, 100 people from this organization or whatever. That helps as well. I'm not saying make it up, but they also like to hear from individuals. And one thing I'll say about Arkansas legislators, a lot of them really do take to heart what their constituents are telling them. So the more our voices are heard, the more we can affect the budget and other legislation. Let me see if I had. I don't think I really had anything after this. Yep, the links are at the end of this. And Rebecca, am I right that participants will be getting the PowerPoint or
Yes,
the
we'll be sending out a follow-up email with the recording, the slide deck, and any other resources that we think are good to share.
awesome. And yes, that gets us to the end of the. Yeah, so questions, discussion. I'd love to hear from some of you and what you're thinking on the budget and other ways you might participate and advocate for things important to you.
Don't see any questions quite yet. Someone said this was very informative. Thank you.
Great, glad to hear it.
Well, if you don't have any questions now and you're going through the materials that we send out, and are looking on the legislature's website about the budget process and things and have more specific questions, feel free to reach out to us if they come up later.
Yes, we're always
Well,
available.
well, thank you so much, Pete, for the presentation. And yes, we'll share out the recording with everyone after this event. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.